After tensions between Trump and Lula last Monday, January 27th, the two finally spoke by phone. It was a 50-minute conversation, and look, it might have been cordial behind the scenes, but the tensions are far from over. They discussed mainly Venezuela, where Trump militarily invaded and captured Nicolás Maduro at the beginning of the month. And Lula didn't mince words. He made it clear he condemns the American invasion in South America, saying it crosses an unacceptable line and is an affront to Venezuelan sovereignty. Trump invited Lula to visit Washington in the coming weeks. Lula accepted, but made it very clear he's coming with conditions on the table: absolute respect for Brazilian sovereignty, and he demanded that Trump's so-called Board of Peace be limited to Gaza only and include Palestinian representation. So it's not like everything's resolved. Lula continues hitting hard. In recent days, he said publicly that Trump wants to govern the world by Twitter, that he's trying to create a new UN where only he gives orders. The criticisms are heavy. Diplomacy continues to function, yes, but trust, that's still on the floor. While Trump tries to balance these tensions with Brazil, with Europe, with half the world questioning whether you can trust the United States, inside the country itself, something much worse exploded. Because just 3 days after that call with Lula, on January 24, 2026, something happened that shook the United States. Alex Preti, a 37-year-old ICU nurse, American citizen with no criminal record, was shot multiple times by federal agents and died. And the streets of the United States exploded into absolute chaos, with thousands of citizens protesting even in sub-zero temperatures. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because what's coming in the next few weeks could define the future of American democracy. Let's get right to it. Trump's second term started exactly with what he'd promised: massive deportation operations and crackdown on protests. In 2025, major operations triggered protests in several states, from Minnesota to California, with thousands in the streets and local strikes against ICE. In Minneapolis, the relationship between the city and the federal apparatus was already at breaking point. A series of protests against deportations and an economic strike that closed more than 700 businesses showed the population was at its limit. But in early 2026, the situation escalated brutally. The intensification of immigration crackdown raised the death toll linked to ICE, CBP, and federal forces actions. International agencies reported that deaths accumulate as Trump's immigration offensive intensifies. In Minnesota, the first case that shocked was Renee Good, a 37-year-old mother killed by an immigration agent on January 7th. An episode that generated articles describing ICE violence as a symbol of the transformation of state force use. A militarized domestic apparatus with a mid-sized country's budget turned not just against immigrants, but against any opponent. This is the context in which the morning of January 24, 2026, in Minneapolis, stops being an isolated incident and becomes a logical consequence of a systematic pattern. On that day, during a federal operation, Alex Jeffrey Preti, a 37-year-old ICU nurse, United States citizen with no criminal record, was shot multiple times by federal agents and died. Initially, the government claimed he had approached agents while armed, representing an immediate threat. But citizens' cameras and serious press did what power hates: looked closely. Washington and the Department of Homeland Security were quick to define the official narrative. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem accused Preti of brandishing a weapon and committing an act of domestic terrorism, repeating the formula that agents had reacted to defend their lives and the lives of the public. The government released a photo of a gun, presenting it as proof that the victim represented a mortal danger. Except videos recorded by witnesses and analyzed by serious news outlets like the New York Times, ABC News, and NPR tell a different story. Preti was participating in a protest against a federal immigration operation and approached when agents pushed other protesters. Images show an agent pushing a protester, Preti intervening, being pushed in the chest, and then targeted with pepper spray. This according to ABC News reporting. In the sequence, at least 6 ICE agents surround him, knock him down, and strike him on the ground. Seconds later, an agent steps away with a gun in hand. Someone shouts, "Gun! Gun!" and a series of shots are fired. Witnesses and a doctor on site reported multiple gunshot wounds in the back and chest, which is difficult to reconcile with a narrative of imminent frontal attack. A New York Times analysis indicated at least 10 shots in about 5 seconds. The BBC described Alex's death as the second fatal shooting of the month involving federal forces in Minneapolis, noting that Governor Tim Walz called the episode a turning point and called for the withdrawal of federal agents from the city. While the government sold a version of armed domestic terrorists, the documented reality was different. An ICU nurse, citizen with a concealed carry permit, killed in circumstances where images suggest he was holding a cell phone, surrounded by agents in clear numerical and tactical advantage. According to the New York Times, this clash between official narrative and empirical evidence isn't an accident, it's technique. And even in harsh winter, the United States boils. After Alex Pretty's death, Minneapolis exploded. Reports from outlets like CNN, ABC, BBC, and NBC converge. Hundreds of people began gathering daily at the shooting site and in front of the federal building to protest, even with temperatures near or below zero. Signs of grassroots organization intensified. Groups on encrypted apps like Signal began monitoring ICE and Border Patrol movements in real time, activating neighbors to surround federal vehicles with horns, whistles, and shouts. Workers, students, and families participated in demonstrations that were often dispersed with tear gas, stun grenades, and arbitrary arrests. One report described this mobilization as a unique level of resistance in Minneapolis. On one side, activists trying to document and embarrass ICE actions. On the other, federal agents apparently more interested in clashing with the population than conducting discreet arrests. But here's the central point. Who really benefits from this chaos? The far right has learned over recent years to capitalize on street conflict. Influencers and hardline politicians use every video of barricades, every broken window, every confrontation with federal agents as fuel for narratives of imminent civil war and the need for an iron fist. In 2025 and 2026, MAGA-aligned commentators and lawmakers openly resumed the language of internal war, invasion, and traitors within the country, seeking to frame any organized resistance as domestic terrorism. In other words, sectors of the far right actually want mass protests, but not because they respect the right to dissent. They want protests as scenery, as stage, as pretext to justify even greater repression. And this is where the discussion about martial law and expanded power comes in. Rumors about Trump declaring martial law have circulated in waves since 2020 and gained new momentum when he reassumed power. Fact checks done by outlets like Newsweek have been clear. There's no formal martial law decree yet. And much of the online alarm confuses martial law with views of the Insurrection Act, an old law that allows deploying troops to contain internal insurrection. But the real danger isn't in the fantasy of a dramatic TV announcement declaring martial law in explicit terms. It's in using existing legal mechanisms to create, in practice, a permanent state of exception. Reports like the authoritarian playbook warn even before the re-election that Trump and his allies plan to abuse various presidential powers, including the Insurrection Act, to use military and federal forces against protests, crush dissent, and expand the executive above any effective control. Legal researchers have pointed out at least 24 legal loopholes that allow the US president to use military on domestic soil under vague conditions, under the banner of combating rebellion or restoring order. In January 2026, Trump publicly signaled this path again. In social media messages, he indicated he could resort to the Insurrection Act to send military to Minneapolis, saying he has a duty to protect states in times of violence. At the same time, reports indicate an expansion of federal forces deployment as a kind of political police, with ICE and DHS functioning as armed wing of an ideological agenda, a practice denounced by organizations like the ACLU. And it's in this context that Alex Pretty's death gains broader political significance. The more images of confrontation, the easier to sustain there's a rebellion underway. The more the government classifies protesters as domestic terrorists, the simpler it becomes to justify, before a frightened public, use of exception tools. And remember I mentioned winter? The protests already happening in freezing temperatures are a preview of what's coming when the weather warms up. Recent US experience shows that major mobilization cycles like Occupy, Black Lives Matter, through women's marches and anti-Trump protests tend to intensify in spring and summer. In 2026, this natural mobilization calendar meets a government already rehearsing paramilitary responses and a far-right base that openly embraces confrontation rhetoric. Analysts interviewed in academic outlets and mainstream press highlight some concrete risks. Escalation of deaths. The more overt ICE and Border Patrol operations in dense urban areas, the more likely new cases like Alex Pretty emerge, victims of aggressive approaches, deficient training, and maximum force doctrine. Normalization of military apparatus use, with Trump publicly flirting with the Insurrection Act and already using federal forces as political police. The danger that the line between public order and military repression is erased in practice. Radicalization of extremist bases. In 2025 and 2026, extremist influencers and politicians have talked about civil war openly, as if it were a desirable scenario, an explicit flirtation with large-scale political violence. At the same time, there are counterforces. Governors, mayors, and courts have tried, with varying degrees of courage, to set limits. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, for example, openly criticized ICE and Border Patrol's role in the state and asked Trump to withdraw agents after Pretty's death. Lawsuits seek to frame the expansion of immigration crackdown and use of lethal force under institutional parameters. And there's an effort by civil rights organizations to document every abuse and contest in court. The dispute, therefore, isn't just in the streets, but also in interpretation of law. Extremist sectors want every act of resistance to serve as proof there's war underway, while democratic movements try to show the real attack on the country comes from a government willing to transform any neighborhood into an occupation zone. And now, let's try to understand what's behind this systematic policy. Violence isn't a byproduct here. It's not fate. Documented facts suggest a pattern. According to analysis by legal scholars, NGOs, and critical analysts, the observed strategy has pillars that repeat. Build a permanent internal enemy. Immigrants, protesters, journalists, opponents are all labeled in bulk as criminals, terrorists, invaders. Use the state as intimidation machine. Border Patrol, DHS, and even military are reorganized not as neutral institutions, but as instruments of ideological loyalty. Wear down any idea of institutional control. By testing constitutional limits with successive abuses of force use and hints about extending term, the government accustoms the public to permanent scandal, until nothing shocks anymore. Reports like the authoritarian playbook were explicit. The goal of a president with autocratic tendencies is to expand the executive, politicize independent institutions, crush dissent, and normalize violence as government tool. Alex Pretty's death, in this sense, isn't a tragic error that breaks the rule. It's the rule in action, documented by videos, witnesses, and forensic analysis. And talking about power expansion for Trump isn't conspiracy theory. It's the political translation of a project that, in experts' words, seeks to erode checks and balances, cloak state violence in dubious legality, and create a climate where challenging the president seems too dangerous for most. The country that watches, in 2026, an ICU nurse being killed on a Minneapolis street by federal agents in front of numerous cameras, and still hears from the government that he was a domestic terrorist, isn't a country heading toward authoritarianism. It's a country already crossed by it. The question isn't whether there's power expansion underway, but how many more deaths American democracy will endure before admitting that no vote, no constitution, and no court are worth much when the state learns to pull the trigger, and when part of the country decides it's better to get used to the sound of gunshots than face whoever's pulling the trigger. What do you think? Comment below. If this video helped you understand what's really happening, help us break through the bubble. 3 fundamental steps. Leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video with everyone you know. Pass it forward, spread it. It costs nothing and you'll be a huge help for verified news to reach more people. Thanks and see you next time.